Hello, EDUC 519. So today's topic, we're going to dive a little bit more into ontology, epistemology, worldview paradigm. You've had some great discussions in Discord about this, and I thank you for being honest about where you are and making sense of these ideas. They are not simple to make sense of, and part of that is their philosophical origins, and there's a lot behind that. So I want to just provide a little bit more material for you to continue to reflect on what these words mean as you prepare to think about that worldview stance paper that you have to write. And I do want to point out that this is a really important topic when you're thinking about research, because the perspective that you have inherently influences the way that you carry out research. It has to do with the lens that you take when you are, let's say, interviewing a person and trying to make sense of that data. It also even impacts the type of data that you collect. And it also influences how you interpret not just qualitative data like interview data, but also quantitative data. So, and I have some issues with the way that these ideas are presented in the text, which is why I've also provided in the assignment details for the Worldview Stance paper 4 additional papers for you to read, articles to read that may help you continue to make sense of what these big ideas are all about. So as we're thinking about what these words mean, I think it's helpful to first start off with the first 2 words here, ontology and epistemology, because really the last 2 words, worldview, paradigm, they have a lot to do with how you think about these first 2 words. So let's think about ontology first. Ontology really is trying to get at this question of, is there a big T truth in the world? And by big T truth, I mean a truth that is objective apart from yourself. And I understand this from my own background's perspective, but we'll get into that in a minute. And that really does also have to do with your epistemology, which is about how knowledge is acquired. These 2 questions are somewhat difficult even to unpack for yourself, because they may be ideas you haven't thought about before. And even if you have, the way that you respond to these questions might be different depending on the circumstances. And that's okay for that to be happening. But as you think about the specific research interest areas that you have, think about these words. They don't have to be answered across your everything that you do. They don't have to be the same. And that's something that some of you in the Discord discussion have struggled with, I notice, is that in one context you may think one way and in another it might be different. And that is the nature of our reality. So you should feel okay with being able to do that. Okay, so is there a big T truth? So imagine the answer to this question on a continuous scale from, yes, there is one big T truth, and then at the other end of the scale, there is only little t truths that are completely subjective and individualized. On that end of the scale, they would reject the entire notion of truth as being possible to exist. So if you think about that difference from completely objective to completely relative, imagine where you might be placed on that scale. Somewhere in the middle, somewhere closer to the objective, somewhere closer to relative, at the far ends of the scale. And then epistemology. How is knowledge acquired? So when you think about this, it also has to do a lot with how you imagine truth. If there is a big T truth out in the world, that's going to have implications on how you think that knowledge can be gained or acquired, or even what word you use to describe this acquired might be a word you use in a specific type of ontological perspective. So let me give you an example. My background involves the teaching of mathematics, and so for a long time, I believed that mathematics was simply our discovering of the world around us. But as I've thought more about this idea and thinking about whether that is true, I've realized that, number one, mathematics has been built by humans, and depending on what group of humans you look at across history, the mathematics might look very different. And ultimately, I have come to the conclusion that mathematics is simply a way of describing the reality of our world as we see it. And so because of that socially developed perspective that allows us to mathematically describe the world around us in order to make sense of it, I don't believe that there is an ontological big T truth about mathematics. The same would go for statistics. I don't think that mathematics allows us to understand the universe as it already exists. I think it simply allows us a way of explaining the world that is around us. So, that is one reason why, when I think about epistemology, or how is knowledge acquired, epistemology has a lot to do with how we learn things. And so when I think about this word, I imagine that knowledge is acquired by our own interactions with the world and with one another, and that our knowledge is constructed based on those experiences. And this is why I tend to fall in the constructivism camp, but also in the camp of sociocultural theory that we haven't talked about, which is more on the side of the way that we interact with language in order to make sense of the world around us. It sort of is related to social constructivism, but depending on who you talk to, those are different ideas. So I think it's important to realize that and to make sense of how you might view that within your own domain, within your own discipline, because it does have implications on what your worldview is, on what your paradigm is. So really, these words, worldview and paradigm, they really are talking about the same kind of thing. It has to do with your perspective on ontology and your epistemology. What are your perspectives on the nature of a big T truth and on how we acquire knowledge? And in a big picture perspective, let's wait for the slide to pop up here. There it goes. In the big perspective on thinking about research, the paradigm and worldview that you have is sort of the big all-encompassing thing around which you adopt specific theories that are aligned with that worldview or that paradigm, that are ways that you try to understand and explain things. And then within that is the specific research methods that you choose in order to help you further make sense of the specific phenomena that you are studying or investigating. So the method that you choose is couched within this theory that helps you explain the data that you have collected, that helps you further explain your analysis, and that sits within your worldview, your paradigm of how you view the world. And then if we take that a little step further, let me show you an example here. Your paradigm informs the theory, which informs your method. So for instance, if my paradigm or worldview involves, and I put this thing in the middle here because sometimes it's called constructionism, sometimes it's called constructivism. They really mean basically the same thing. then you might pick a specific theory within that called radical constructivism. And then within that theory, you might choose a specific method called a teaching experiment. And the reason that these things are in line is because radical constructivism is a theory about how people learn. And within that, a specific method has been developed called a teaching experiment that involves sitting down with students and really exploring what their knowledge currently looks like. And it was developed specifically to be in line with radical constructivism. And I won't go into detail here about that, but just know that this is one way that things could look, and they all should align with one another in this way. So you're sort of digging down into smaller subsets of ideas. So then there are these 4 different paradigms, and they all imply some different ontologies or epistemologies. However, it's important to realize that they are not mutually exclusive paradigms. There are overlaps. You can exist in more than one place at a time. And also, these are not the only paradigms that exist. There are others, and the field is constantly emerging with new ideas that ultimately end up developing new paradigms. So, I mean, for instance, post-positivism. It's called post-positivism because there's also a positivism, and it has expanded, and the field has generated new ideas that have led to what is now called post-positivism, after the idea of positivism, which implies that positivism is sort of dead, but it's not. There are still some people out there who align with that perspective, although I think probably most people would not. These ideas are it's important to realize that even though in the book Creswell may have made it seem like these ideas are disjoint from one another, that is certainly not the case, and there are people who straddle the lines in between these. I am one of those people. And as you read the idea of transformative and pragmatic, and it seems like those are definitely places where things can overlap with post-positivism and constructivism, but I also believe that constructivism and post-positivism have room for overlap between them. For instance, one of the claims that Creswell makes is that post-positivism aligns with a specific method of using quantitative data. I think that that is a false assumption. It doesn't require that things are quantitative at all. It has to do with the way that you interpret meaning from the data that you collect. I think that someone can be a constructivist and also sit within the world of post-positivism, at least somewhat. Or I think that a constructivist person can also have the use for quantitative data. It all depends on how you are looking at that data, what you're trying to do from it, and how you're extracting meaning from it. So keep that in mind as you're reading these things. I encourage you, I'm not going to go into detail at this point, but please read those articles, one on post-positivism, one on constructivism, one on transformative, and one on pragmatic. I think those will be really helpful as you start to try to unpack this a little bit more. And here in a couple of days, I will post a new video in order to unpack these a little bit further based on what people are needing. So I'm not going to cut off this conversation. Please continue to talk within Discord about the things that you're struggling with. And I hope that this video helps you unpack this a little bit more.